My name is Master Sgt. Corry Yokley. I'm with the 944th Fighter Wing, Aeromedical Staging Squadron. So I've been in the Air Force for 19 years. My main job is medical logistics, so I support the medical mission with the Air Force. I've always been in the reserve. A large part of why I joined the Air Force is I grew up next to an Air Force base. It has since closed, but I grew up next to an Air Force base, so that had a lot to do with me joining the Air Force opposed to Army, Marines, Navy. The reserve, I just like the idea of being able to be a citizen airman, still have my civilian job, and be able to fight for and defend our country when needed. So I've been with the 944th Fighter Wing for a little under 3 years. I transferred from Travis. I had been flying from Phoenix to Travis for 3 years. So when I joined the unit here, I was very excited to be closer to home and just start a new chapter in my Air Force career. So I joined in December of 2020. So I was excited to be here, be part of the 944th. And my civilian job, at the same time, I got a promotion, a new management promotion. So life was looking good. And about 3 months after that, in March of 2021, I was informed I needed to fill a short task deployment to Afghanistan. This was a little bit interesting to me since we were supposed to be leaving Afghanistan, so I wasn't quite sure why I was going, but nevertheless, I was there to answer the call. But I was very anxious. I wasn't sure what to expect. This was a deployment to Afghanistan. We were supposed to be leaving. And again, everything was new to me, and I didn't deploy with anybody else that I knew. So I was the only one from the 944th going to that part of the theater. I landed in Bagram, I think the first week of May. Upon landing there, I was given instruction and was told that we were going to retrograde the hospital. But that shouldn't take longer than 2 months. So our goal was to be out of Bagram by July. I was excited about that. It would only be 2 or 3 months deployment and I'd be home. However, 3 weeks into being there, I was told that a small group of us would forward deploy to Kabul. And the purpose of that was to support the embassy, medical support for the embassy, as long as they were in theater. Retrograding is basically, it's it's throwing away a lot of trash, things that may be accumulated over the course of 20 years. But a large part of that is making sure that we send back all of our assets, so all the medical equipment, things worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, make sure it gets back into our hands stateside so that it can be reutilized. And it wasn't just us retrograding, the whole base was retrograding, so you got to keep in mind we didn't have all the amenities that you would normally have, so we didn't have a shopette, barber, post office, any of those things, so we had to plan accordingly for the last few weeks that we were there. So that means we had to make sure we had enough food, enough deodorant, all those things. But it did come to an end. I actually left to go to Kabul a few weeks before everyone else, and everyone else that stayed in Bagram, they did leave the theater and come back home a couple weeks after that. So in total, I was at Bagram for about 5 weeks, and the beginning of June is when I left, took a C-130 and hopped on over to Hkaa at Kabul. Bagram was a ghost town. Everything is shut down. When we got to Hkaa in Kabul, it was kind of refreshing. They still had some of their amenities there, so we could buy toiletries, a couple restaurants, chow hall was great, those things. So it was nice. However, that was short-lived. About a month or two after that, all of that started being retrograded and going away as well. So when I got there, the pace was fairly slow. We were integrating with the Norwegians, trying to figure out how we were going to run the hospital. A lot of their equipment won't work with our supplies, and a lot of our supplies won't work with their equipment. So we had to work very closely to figure out what medical equipment and how we were going to do this, basically, how we were going to share responsibility and integrate equipment on both sides to make sure that we provided the best possible care for whoever was brought to us. So let me back up and give a little bit of a timeline. So I arrived in Kabul, I think June 10th. So I get there, I'm on the ground, figuring out a way to again share responsibility with the Norwegians and run the hospital together. At the same time, it was a couple weeks later, I believe he was Navy captain came in, and he was in charge of all the medical elements for a NEO mission that I had never heard of before. And basically this was in prep to get all of the Afghan refugees, well, out of the country. And part of that, because COVID was going on at the time, we needed PPE for those individuals. If you get an influx of 100,000 people on base or more, you know, you got to stop the spread of COVID. So additionally, I was tasked with getting those medical supplies or PPE supplies brought in, so gloves, masks, those sorts of things for all these individuals who could potentially be on our planes and leaving the country. There was nothing guaranteed that this was going to happen, but it was a preparation we were making. Beyond that, third task I was given was to find a contingency location in case something was to happen. So in case something happened to the Roll 2 hospital, we need a contingency location to bug out to that has pre-positioned medical equipment and supplies where we can carry on medical care in the event that the Roll 2 hospital is no longer usable. So that, doing these other things, the NEO mission and the contingency hospital, kind of made me realize how real the situation was. If we were preparing for these things, then something bad could happen. So that was my first taste of that. Over the next few weeks, life was, life was just your day-to-day normal, get a patient here, a patient there. However, we did get security briefs every week where you could see the Taliban was closing in and starting to surround the capital city of Kabul, right where we were at. A little nerve-wracking. You see them moving in and surrounding you, and really at that point your only way out is air support. But even that, at the time, was a little dangerous. Yep. So as we're doing all of the planning and we saw the Taliban closing in closer and closer to Kabul, I knew, it was a matter of time before they were going to be at our doorstep. And that's exactly what happened. They took over the capital, and once they did that, local citizens started to panic, and they came and rushed the airport and the airfield, because that was their only way out. They were scared, they were terrified, they wanted a way out. So that's what prompted everything. And shortly thereafter, we started the evacuations. It was about a week and a half later, after those tens of thousands of people started gathering at the gate, that we were getting reports of possible attacks and suicide bombs. So we were taking things very, very seriously. And unfortunately, on August 26th at about 5:50 p.m., a suicide bomb did go off, and we received an influx of 70 plus patients during a mass Hkaa. We prepared the best we could. So basically full battle rattle, helmet, 24/7, those sorts of things, staying away from the barrier walls. My job as a logistician required that I was driving a lot and I was around the base quite a bit, and I was near the walls. So it could be considered, it could have been dangerous, yeah. But we took all the precautions, necessary that we could in that situation. When the mass Hkaa happened, I had just left the hospital, went back to my dorm room, and I was there for 10 minutes, and then we get an alert that there's a mass casualty event. Mass casualty can be anywhere from a handful of people up to, thousands, or, however you want to categorize it. So we weren't sure how many people we were going to get, because I did not hear the bomb go off. But when we showed up, just people upon people just started showing up in vehicles of opportunity. Marines driving their friends who are injured, driving them in on flatbed trucks, just whatever they could find. The proximity of the bomb, as a crow flies, was only about 3/4 of a mile from the hospital. The route they had to drive was about 2.5 miles to get around the airfield to the hospital. But when the casualties started showing up, I can only explain it as something that you see in a movie. You watch these movies, you wonder if they're real, if that's how things really happen. A lot of it, I'm sure, is far-fetched, but for me, the only way I can explain it, it was like a movie. Just people upon people that were, victims of the bomb just kept showing up. It was very, I don't want to say chaotic, because there was a lot going on, because we all knew what we were supposed to do. There was a lot going on at one time. And there was a lot of blast injuries, a lot of blood. There was deceased personnel being brought in. And me being a medical logistician, I'm not clinical, but I'm still there to help any way I can. So let's bring them into the hospital, trying to help triage them. Once they were all brought into the hospital, probably over the course of a couple hours it took for them all to get into the hospital, then I was running around, touching base with all of the surgeons and nurses and anybody else who needed supplies and equipment to make sure that there was enough to stabilize these patients, these casualties, to get them back to the U.S. Not getting into too much about the evacuation and you know, how it took place. From a medical point of view, we were called in and we took care of many individuals who maybe had heat stroke. We had babies and expectant mothers on base that we're not usually used to taking care of. So we had, you know, pregnant women in our care. We had newborn babies in our care. We had a lot of orphans who had been separated from their parents. There were parents handing their children over the walls so that they could get to a safer place, you know, kind of sacrificing their own lives so that their children can have a better life. But in doing so, they ended up at the hospital, and we became the orphanage, basically, we referred to it. We had a lot of children there that had no parents. There's two that stand out with me, I think, directly because I was involved. One was a couple hours after the mass casualty, so after the bombs went off, a couple hours I was outside trying to work through some pallets of medical supplies, and a female Marine came up to me with 3 children. The youngest was probably about 5, the oldest was maybe 13, and she basically brought them to me and said her parents were just killed in this attack. I don't know what to do with these kids. So I brought them inside and kind of turned them over to our medical personnel that was taking care of the orphans, if you will. I don't know what happened to them after that point, but that kind of sticks with you. You know, what did those kids just see? I mean, they probably saw everything that I saw. And they just lost both their parents, and you know, now what are they going to do? And the other experiences, I was in my logistics office, and there's a door to the outside that's not a common walkway, and I get a bang on this door, which is kind of uncommon. This was maybe around 8 o'clock at night, so I go answer the door. There's an Afghan woman there and 3 Marines, and basically she's looking for her child. She was separated from her child that was maybe 1.5. She was very frantic, wanting to know if her child was at the hospital with us. So like I had mentioned, we were an orphanage and we had multiple children there. So I walked her and the Marines into the hospital. I put them in contact with, again, our medical personnel who were kind of maintaining security for those children, because we didn't, you know, want them, you know, walking off or getting into the wrong hands. Basically, through a series of confirming that this was the child's mother, they were reunited. I was standing nearby, and I wish I had my camera with me, but the amount of joy on that mother's face is, that's going to stick with you. She was so excited and just elated that she was reunited with her baby, and because many of those children probably never were again, or it might still be being worked out at this time, I'm not sure, but it's very close to her not being reunited with her child. So the last 3 days we were there, we also lost all communication, so that was a little unnerving. So I had limited communication with my command already, because my command there in theater did not want me to speak too much about what was going on. But those last 3 days I wasn't unable to contact anybody in my family. I couldn't contact anybody at my home base. We were just like blacked out, basically. And this was right after the suicide bombing had happened. So you can imagine people at home weren't sure what was going on. You know, there was a lot of panic. My family was very panicked, not knowing when or if they'd hear from me again. So it was a little unnerving for everybody. You know, so starting at the beginning, being in Bagram, we knew that we were part of history there. Not knowing what was going to take place after that. Closing down Craig Joint Theater Hospital is, in the medical community, that's monumental. That hospital's been there for around 20 years, named after an Army combat medic who was basically killed in the line of duty, gave his life to save others, and that's why the hospital was named after him. The hospital's been there the whole time we've been in theater, and it's, saved many military members and brought them home. So it was a very kind of somber moment to be a part of that. We knew it was part of history. We're also proud to do that, to make sure that it was done correctly and with honor, as the hospital should be closed down. Moving on to Kabul, had no idea what that was going to entail and how big that was going to be on the world platform, which I found out when I got home. While I was there, really had no idea. During the suicide bomb mass casualty attack, we did get some sense of it. 30 minutes after it happened, it was already all over the news. And so we were watching the news report on it as we were in the middle of taking care of patients. It was very surreal type feeling to watch us being reported on as we were still trying to save people's lives. After I got home, I started to realize the impact and the magnitude of what had happened. I didn't see a lot of what was reported on TV, or there was a lot of misinformation. So kind of dealing with that and making my way through that when I got home was a little difficult. Different from what I lived, the reality that I experienced, So I think going through this situation, it basically gave me a lot more courage. It allowed me to know that, I can operate in any type of environment. The Air Force talks a lot about resiliency, and it was real in this situation. I mean, I went from being at a unit for 3 months, having a new civilian job, to deploying to Afghanistan, not knowing what was going to happen, Bagram, to thinking I was coming home, to saying, oh, just kidding, now you're going to Kabul to perform a mission, which turned into 2 or 3 different missions while I was there. I feel like I was only in theater for 4 months, but it felt like 2 or 3 deployments, in one. I think having the right mindset when you're there is important. It would have been very easy to become negative and disgruntled, and then it wouldn't have been good for anyone. So I think that the biggest takeaways for me is resiliency, as it should be anytime we go to war or are in battle. We got to keep going, keep picking ourselves up, and then just having the courage to do so. And having a good support network at home and also while you're in theater. Being able to rely on your airmen. We were deployed there with a lot of Army as well, so my fellow soldiers, who I became great friends with. Anybody on this deployment that I was at the hospital with, there was about 50 of us, I trust any of them with my life. And that's the way you want to feel and the way you want to be when you're in that type of environment. One thing that I will say, I think we sometimes forget about, is we remember the soldiers in the field and those that were, in those situations. But I think the medical personnel are sometimes forgotten about, because we are professionals in the medical field. We forget that they also need to speak to people from what they've seen. When you're subjected to that amount of, I guess, injuries, carnage, whatever you want to call it, all at one time, and you see people, fighting for their lives, it can have a huge effect, and there are people in the hospital who are also not necessarily clinical, but you have logistics and pharmacy and admin who are all there doing the same thing and supporting the mission, so they're around that. And sometimes they need somebody to talk to as well. So we can't forget the medical personnel after these events also need to be taken into consideration, and they need to talk to somebody too. I didn't feel like any of this ended until I had boots on ground back here at Luke. Because at any given time, they could have kept me in theater. There could have been a need. I still hadn't fulfilled my, 6-month duty, but even then, they still could have held me longer than 6 months if they chose to. But we left Hkaa in Kabul, I believe it was the 30th of August, and arrived in Qatar, Al Udeid. We were there for about 10 days, kind of getting some R&R, but all the refugees that left Afghanistan, most of them were in Qatar. And so there was still a huge need for medical personnel in Qatar as they're trying to process them and do what they needed to do. So it was still, we could have stayed there. They could have kept us there. However, there was enough medical presence that had been brought in from other units throughout the U.S. and Army, Air Force, and they decided that we weren't needed, so they let us come home. So flew from there to the East Coast. Even on the East Coast, I still wasn't very, I was back in the country, but I still wasn't very settled until I was back here, at Luke, doing my travel voucher, basically. About a year after I returned, I actually took on the role as the 944th Fighter Wing's exercise and plans flight chief. So I've been able to help implement exercises for the wing as a whole. And then a subset of that, I am able to help plan exercises for the ASTS. We've successfully completed, I think, 2 or 3 in the last year. And a large part of that has to do with my experience and others' experiences who were deployed. And kind of just changing the way we think about how we operate in a contested environment. It's important, we're here 1 week in a month, but it's important that we take our training seriously, because you never know when you're going to use it. Doing it over and over again, creating that muscle memory, knowing what you're supposed to do in any given situation. That way you just do it, because talking from a medical point of view, when you're in a mass casualty like that and 60 people are brought to you at one time and they're all bleeding out, you don't want to just freeze up and not know what to do. And so I did have a slight moment where maybe 10, 15 seconds, I kind of did freeze up because I wasn't sure, because it was just so much happening, wasn't sure what to do, and then I kind of snapped out of it and then just went to work, doing what I'd been training to do the last almost 20 years. So triage patients, helping the med techs with whatever I could, all of those different things. And so, training. I know we don't always like to do it on the weekends, but it's important. And that's really what I was able to see. So during the mass casualty, I was able to see we had U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, Norwegians, UK, Australians, Italians. I might be missing a couple. Different medical entities or different medical personnel from all those countries working together. And you could see that even though there was a lot going on, we all kind of spoke the same language when it came to medical, and we're all able to come together and help all those casualties. And it was all because of our training and, muscle memory and, our dedication to saving lives. So one of the biggest reasons I like to share now is because there were 13 members who were killed in that suicide attack. They cannot be forgotten. Us medical personnel who were there were very close to that. We brought all 13 of them in. I myself made sure that we had the caskets and the flags. And then beyond that, we still forget that there were other U.S. soldiers that were injured, that they survived, but they were injured, and they don't get talked about that much as well. They put their lives on the line. So a large part of this, talking about it, is making sure that they're not forgotten, for sure. And then there's a large part of this that is just bringing awareness to individuals and, letting people know that, things like this can happen that are unpredictable, and you just need to be prepared. Somebody, struggling maybe to come in on the weekends, that just stick with it. You'll get your opportunity. The TDYs and deployments will be there. Just keep up with your training and be ready. But at the same time, you might come across an accident on the freeway, or God forbid, an active shooter or something of that nature. All of your training you get here will be put to good use, anytime, anywhere. So just stick with it. It's, anything you get on this side, on the military side in uniform, you can use on the civilian side. So.